experimentation refers to the testing and evaluation of a new drug or procedure on a human person in order to gain generalizable knowledge that can be used for various purposes. While most experiments are for the good of mankind, but mostly money, the others are pure evil. Today, we will be taking a look at 5 most messed up experiments in the human history. Japan's Unit 731. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, the Japanese Imperial Army conducted biological warfare and medical testing on civilians, mostly in China. The death toll of these brutal experiments is unknown, but as many as 200,000 may have died, according to a 1995 New York Times report. Among the atrocities were infected with cholera and typhoid and plague-ridden fleas spread across Chinese cities. Prisoners were marched in freezing weather and then experimented on to determine the best treatment for frostbite. Former members of the unit have told media outlets that prisoners were dosed with poison gas, put in pressured chambers until their eyes popped out, and even dissected while alive and conscious. After the war, the U.S. government helped keep the experiment secret as part of a plan to make Japan a Cold War ally, according to the New York Times report. 4. The Burke and Hale murders. Until the 1830s, the only legally available bodies for dissection by anatomists were those of executed murderers. Executed murderers being a relative rarity, many anatomists took to buying bodies from grave robbers or doing the robbing themselves. Edinburgh boarding house owner William Hare and his friend William Burke took this entrepreneurial activity one step further. From 1827 to 1828, the two men smothered more than a dozen lodgers at the boarding house and sold their bodies to anatomist Robert Knox, according to Mary Roach's Stiff, The Curious Lives of Human Cadavers, W. W. Norton and Company, 2003. Knox apparently didn't notice, or didn't care, that the bodies his newest suppliers were bringing him were suspiciously fresh, Roach wrote. Burke was later hanged for his crimes, and the case spurred the British government to loosen the restrictions on dissection. Number 3. Surgical experiments on slaves. The father of modern gynecology, J. Marion Sims, gained much of his fame by doing experimental surgeries, sometimes several per person, on slave women. Sims remains a controversial figure to this day because the condition he was treating in the women, vesico-vaginal fistula, caused terrible suffering. Women with fistulas, a tear between the vagina and bladder, were incontinent and were often rejected by society. Sims performed the surgeries without anesthesia, in part because anesthesia had only recently been discovered, and in part because Sims believed the operations were not painful enough to justify the trouble, as he said in an 1857 lecture. Arguments still rage as to whether Sims' patients would have consented to the surgeries had they been entirely free to choose. Nonetheless, wrote University of Alabama social work professor Durenda Ojenuga in the Journal of Medical Ethics in 1993, Sims manipulated the social institution of slavery to perform human experimentations, which by any standard is unacceptable. Number 2. Stanford Prison Experiment. In 1971, Philip Zimbardo, now Professor Emeritus of Psychology at Stanford University, set out to test the nature of human nature, to answer questions such as what happens when you put good people in evil situations. How he went about answering his human nature questions was and is thought by many to have been less than ethical. He set up a prison and paid college students to play guards and prisoners, who inevitably seemed to transform into abusive guards and hysterical prisoners. The 2-week experiment was shut down after just 6 days because things turned chaotic fast. In only a few days, our guards became sadistic, and our prisoners became depressed and showed signs of extreme stress, Zimbardo writes on his website. The guards, pretty much from the get-go, treated the prisoners awfully, humiliating them by stripping them naked and spraying their bodies with delousing chemicals, and generally harassing and intimidating them. Number 1. Nazi medical experiments. Perhaps the most infamous evil experiments of all time were those carried out by Joseph Mengele, an SS physician at Auschwitz. Mengele combed the incoming trains for twins upon which to experiment, hoping to prove his theories of the racial supremacy of Aryans. Many died in the process. He also collected the eyes of his dead patients, according to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. The Nazis used prisoners to test treatments for infectious diseases and chemical warfare. Others were forced into freezing temperatures and low-pressure chambers for aviation experiments. Countless prisoners were subjected to experimental sterilization procedures. One woman had her breasts tied off with string, so SS doctors could see how long it took her baby to starve, according to an oral history collected by the Holocaust Museum. She eventually injected the child with a lethal dose of morphine to keep it from suffering longer. Some of the doctors responsible for these atrocities were later tried as war criminals, but Mengele escaped to South America. He died in Brazil in 1979 of a stroke.